Welcome to this explainer. If you're looking at pharma companies developing the next generation of therapies, you know the financial and clinical implications are just absolutely massive. So what exactly is driving this modern gold rush? Well, we're looking at a landscape where literally billions of dollars in revenue are shifting hands. Understanding how these drugs are developed, regulated, and commercialized is absolutely essential for anyone involved in pharma business strategy today. Let's get right into it.
You've probably heard one specific phrase echoing in pharma boardrooms lately: the patent cliff. This is the critical financial window that creates just a massive opportunity for pharmaceutical companies. You see, when a blockbuster originator biologic drug finally loses its patent protection and market exclusivity, it essentially steps off a cliff. For the original manufacturer, revenue plummets. But for competitor biopharma companies, man, this cliff is a starting gun. It opens the door for new entrants to capture enormous market share. Timing this market entry is literally the lifeblood of any successful pharma business development team.
Today, we're going to map out our journey through 5 key areas. We'll start with understanding biosimilars, look at how they compare to generics, walk through the actual development journey, map out those tricky regulatory pathways, and finally, bring it all together with business development strategy.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Understanding Biosimilars.
So, what are we talking about here? Well, a biosimilar is exactly what it sounds like, a biological medicine that is highly similar to an already approved reference biologic. Think of a famous drug like Humira. Now, the absolute key phrase here is highly similar, meaning there are absolutely no clinically meaningful differences in safety, purity, or potency. You might be wondering why highly similar and not identical. Well, it's because these drugs are massive, complex molecules produced by living systems, like mammalian cells or bacteria. You just can't perfectly copy a living process, but you can engineer a product that acts so similarly in the human body that the clinical result is completely indistinguishable from the original.
All right, let's move right along to Section 2, Generics versus Biosimilars.
Now, we all know generics, right? You go to the pharmacy and grab a generic aspirin instead of the brand name. Generics are small molecule drugs. They are chemically identical, exact mathematical copies of the original. But biosimilars, they are entirely different beasts. They're massive, highly complex biologics. And here's the crucial part for pharma developers. Because of intellectual property restrictions, you can't just use the original creator's manufacturing cell lines. Nope, you actually have to reverse engineer your own unique cell line to create a product that matches the original. It's incredibly difficult science, to say the least.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, the development journey. Because these are biological products made from living cells, developers have to rigorously assess something called immunogenicity. This is simply the ability of a substance to provoke an immune response. If a biosimilar has even a slight variation in its protein folding or just a tiny impurity, the patient's immune system might recognize it as a foreign invader and attack it. And if that happens, not only does the drug stop working, but it could trigger a really dangerous, potentially fatal immune reaction in the patient. This is exactly why biosimilar development requires a level of intense safety scrutiny that standard generics just don't need.
Now, what about interchangeability? In the US, this is a much stricter FDA standard than just proving your drug is a biosimilar. If you manage to achieve that interchangeable designation, a pharmacist can automatically substitute your biosimilar for the expensive reference product right at the pharmacy counter, without ever having to call the prescribing doctor. From a business development perspective, achieving this standard is a massive commercial advantage. It drastically accelerates market adoption.
Now, here is where pharma companies can finally catch a bit of a break. Utilizing a totality of evidence approach, regulators might grant what's known as extrapolation of indications. Let's say the original biologic treats 5 different autoimmune diseases. If your company proves, through rigorous testing, that your biosimilar works perfectly for one of those diseases, regulators might actually allow approval for the other 4 uses without forcing you to run separate, incredibly expensive clinical trials for every single one. Proving success in just one disease can unlock a much wider market. Talk about a game changer. The grueling 4-step process every biosimilar must survive actually flips traditional drug development completely on its head. With a brand new drug, the biggest hurdle is usually step 3, the clinical trials. But with biosimilars, the heavy lifting happens way earlier, in step 1, analytical comparison. You spend incredible amounts of time and money in the lab, proving that the molecular structure, the glycosylation, and the folding are virtually identical to the original drug. For a pharma company, this means completely reallocating your R&D resources. You shift away from late-stage clinical trials and front-load them into intensive lab characterization. If you build a flawless foundation there, then you move to non-clinical toxicity studies, into a highly targeted clinical trial, and finally push for that extrapolation and regulatory approval.
Next up is Section 4, Regulatory Pathways.
The rulebook definitely changes depending on where you are on the map. The EMA in Europe is really the granddaddy of this space. They pioneered these definitions way back in 2006 and have a very mature market today. The US FDA governs this through the BPCIA, and while they started a bit later, they are moving aggressively. The WHO sets a great global baseline, but if your company is looking at emerging markets, well, things get very nuanced. Russia and the CIS region are dealing with evolving EAE regulations and hybrid approval pathways, while India's CDSCO has had specific, constantly updated guidelines in place since 2012. You absolutely need a targeted regulatory strategy for every single market you want to enter.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, Business Development Strategy.
The financial barrier to entry here is just staggering. Developing a single biosimilar costs anywhere between $100 to $300 million. Let that sink in for a second. That is far higher than standard generics, which might only cost a few $1,000,000 to develop. For a business development team evaluating an internal project or an in-licensing opportunity, this number dictates everything. You are taking on a massive financial risk, meaning you can only realistically target originators that have multi-billion-dollar revenues just to ensure a viable return on your investment.
And it's not just the cost. The timeline to get to market takes roughly 5 to 8 years from laboratory characterization to final approval. So while developing a biosimilar is certainly faster than inventing a brand new innovator drug from scratch, it still demands significant clinical time and immense patience. Make no mistake, this is a long-term strategic play, definitely not a quick win.
Because of these massive costs and long timelines, the market dynamics we see are pretty unique. When a standard generic hits the market, the price of the drug often plummets by 80 or 90%. But with biosimilars, we actually see limited price erosion. Usually, prices only drop about 30 to 50%. This means much healthier margins for the developers. But the operational complexities, they are immense. These drugs require cold chain logistics. You can't just toss them in a warehouse. They have to be kept strictly temperature controlled. And because of the immunogenicity risks we discussed earlier, you also need robust post-launch pharmacovigilance to monitor patients safely. Consequently, this whole space is dominated by a few key players, like Amgen, Biocon, Sandoz, and Celltrion. Plus, there's a massive reliance on partnering models, like co-development and outsourced contract manufacturing, just to share all that risk.
Bringing it all together, we can see exactly what this looks like out there in the real world. Just look at heavy-hitting originators like Humira, used for rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis, or Herceptin, which is a life-saving breast cancer drug. These were once unchallenged billion-dollar monopolies. Now, they have highly successful, rigorously tested biosimilars competing directly against them. Drugs like Amjevita or Ogivri are on the market right now, driving down healthcare costs, expanding patient access to essential therapies, and capturing immense revenue for the pharmaceutical companies that successfully navigated the development journey we just outlined.
Knowing the massive clinical hurdles, the $300 million price tags, and the complex global regulations involved, it really leaves us wondering exactly how global pharmaceutical dominance will shift next. As complex biosimilars continue to erode originator monopolies, will the legacy originators adapt, or will a new class of agile, biosimilar-focused titans take the crown? Keep that question in mind as this incredible market unfolds. Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and we'll see you next time.